Alara Reborn was released in 2009 as the third and final set in Alara block. The block had a focus on multicolored, and in particular the three colored shards. In fact, the names that these shards were given in Alara block, like Bant, Grixis, and Jund, have stuck around as the names we use for any cards or decks that have the same three-color combination as those factions did in the Alara sets. While all of the Alara sets were focused on multicolored, Alara Reborn took this to an extreme. All 145 cards in Alara Reborn are multicolored. It's the only set in Magic where that's the case. To be eligible for this top 10, a card had to receive its original printing in Alara Reborn. In this video, we'll look at the 10 Alara Reborn cards that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where first tier top 8s, like Pro Tours, are awarded 2 points, and second tier top 8s, like Regional Championships, are awarded with 1 point. At number 10, it's Bituminous Blast. For 3 generic, a black, and a red, it's an instant that does 4 damage to target creature, and it has Cascade, a powerful mechanic that made its debut in Alara Reborn. When you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You can cast that card without paying its mana cost, and then you put the exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So while you're certainly overpaying when you spend 5 mana to do 4 to something, Cascade means you're also going to get another spell for free, and it's also a cast trigger, so if your opponent counters this spell, you still get the Cascade. These days, I think Cascade is mostly thought of as a combo enabler, more on that later, but it's also just an inherently powerful mechanic that gives you great value. For the most part, Bituminous Blast's points in Standard, Extended, and Modern simply came because it could so efficiently give you a 2-for-1. In fact, Jund mid-range decks in those formats leaned pretty hard on generating lots of 2-for-1s, and the Blast was a great way to do it. It hasn't put up any top 8 since 2013 though. This is because it's too expensive to be a reliable combo enabler, like some of the cheaper Cascade cards we'll see higher on the list. At number 9, it's Zealous Persecution. For a black and a white, it's an instant that gives all of your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn, and all of your opponent's creatures -1/-1 until end of turn. Obviously, this can outright kill a bunch of X1s, and the combined effect of +1/+1 to your board and -1/-1 to your opponent's is going to make your creatures very capable of winning combat most of the time, in addition to doing tons of damage if your opponent can't block. In Standard, it was mostly played in token decks, where it was kind of an interesting card, since it was great for you if you were the token deck, but also pretty devastating against the token deck. It's been more successful in non-rotating formats. It found its way into some modern sideboards because it's good against decks with lots of X1s, and it was an especially good way to deal with Slippery Bogle and its friends. Similarly, it was played a fair bit in Legacy because it kills lots of problematic X1s, with True Name Nemesis being the most high-profile one it's capable of taking down. However, Zealous Persecution doesn't have any points since 2018. At number 8, it's Putrid Leech. For a black and a green, it's a 2/2, and you can pay 2 life once a turn to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. In other words, it's pretty much a 2-mana 4/4, and even when you have to pay life for that, you're getting a very efficient creature, one that other early game creatures simply can't compete with, especially in Standard and Extended at the time. Its points all came between 2009 and 2011 in those two formats, where during that time it was one of the premier 2-drops. At number 7, it's Architects of Will. For 2 generic, a blue, and a black, it's a 3/3 artifact creature, and when it enters, you look at the top 3 cards of target player's library and put them back in any order. You can also cycle it for 1 blue-black hybrid mana. Alara block was the first set to have colored artifacts as a prominent theme, with most Esper cards in the block being artifacts, and the Architects are an example of that. While not being especially impressive when you're spending 4 mana on it, having an easy-to-pay cycling ability is a big deal, and it means you can always pitch this and draw a card and then get some value back later, and that's typically what people have been doing with it. Most of its points have come in Modern, where it's been played in Living Index. These decks are constructed in such a way that if they cast a 3-mana card with Cascade, they always hit Living In and reanimate their entire graveyard. It accomplishes this by playing lots of cycling creatures that cost 4 or more mana. So the game plan is to cycle a bunch of those away and then cascade into Living End and reanimate all your cycling creatures, including your Architects of Will. And all of your opponent's creatures in play get killed too. The Architect's Inter-Trigger can actually be pretty relevant, as you typically need another turn to kill your opponent with a Living End deck, and the Architects can make sure they aren't about to draw something that can keep you from winning the game. It's also played in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, and there it's played in a combo deck too, one that looks to constantly cycle creatures on the cheap, cast Songs of the Damned to get mana out of those graveyard creatures, then cast Reaping the Graves to rebuy them and cycle them all over again. With something like Draina's Stinger in play, this results in a loop that kills your opponent. The Architects are going to continue to put up top 8s in both Modern and Pauper, and there's a good chance it claims a higher spot on this list in the future. At number 6, it's Thopter Foundry, another Esper artifact, and another card almost exclusively featured in combo decks. For a white-black hybrid mana and a blue mana, it comes with an activated ability that requires you to spend 1 generic and sacrifice a non-token artifact to create a 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and you gain 1 life. In a vacuum, that ability doesn't seem very impressive. After all, you have to give up a non-token to get a token, but there are a number of shenanigans you can pull with this card. Most famously, you can combine it with Sword of the Meek. If you do, you have the ability to make a 1/1 flyer and gain 1 life for every single mana you have every turn. This is because you sacrifice the sword to the Foundry, then you get a 1/1, which makes the sword come back from the graveyard and attach itself to the Thopter, and then you can sacrifice it again and keep going from there. This combo was so good that the sword got banned out of Extended and preemptively banned in Modern, and it was also powerful enough to make some noise in Legacy. The sword did eventually get unbanned in Modern in 2016, allowing the so-called Thopter Sword combo to be reunited. So the Foundry was already pretty good, but the printing of Urza Lord High Artificer and Goblin Engineer in Modern Horizons really led to a resurgence of the Thopter Sword combo. The Engineer lets you tutor up artifacts and put them into your graveyard, which is exactly where you want Sword of the Meek, and Urza makes it so every artifact you control can tap for blue, and that means you can now go infinite with the Foundry combo, since each new Thopter can tap for blue to pay for the Foundry's ability. This combo has also proved powerful enough for Legacy. Thopter Foundry is going to keep putting up top 8s, and some of the top 5 cards in this list are inactive, so it will probably move higher in the long run. At number 5, I've included 2 cards because they almost have the same score, and they are played for largely the same reason, frequently together. Both of them are 3-mana Cascade cards that are played mostly because they enable combos, unlike Bituminous Blast, which we saw earlier. Violent Outburst is a legitimate number 5, and Ardent Plea would have been number 6 if it was given its own spot on the list. The Outburst is an instant that costs 1 generic, a red, and a green, and in addition to cascading, it also gives your creatures +1/+0 until end of turn, and Ardent Plea is an enchantment for 1 generic, a white, and a blue, and in addition to a cascade trigger, it also has Exalted, which means that if you have a creature attack alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. When Cascade made its debut, it quickly became apparent that you could do some crazy things with the Time Spiral Suspend cards that had no mana value. This became clear in Extended first, where both the Outburst and Plea were played in Hypergenesis decks, which would always cascade into the eponymous card, at which point they'd put a huge threat into play in the extreme early game. While your opponent also got that opportunity, you could usually outdo them because you had more huge creatures than they did, and some of them could even remove the creatures your opponent put into play for free, like Angel of Despair. Ultimately, Hypergenesis got banned in Extended and preemptively banned in Modern, and it remains banned in Modern today. But you already know from our discussion of Architects of Will that there's another suspend card that can be abused by these cheap Cascade cards, and that's Living End, a deck that's been a factor in Modern since the format was created in 2011. Since the release of Modern Horizons in 2019, both of these have also been used alongside Crashing Footfalls to great effect. While that doesn't have quite as game-breaking of an effect, it does give you 2 Rhinos as early as turn 2, which is pretty challenging to beat. In addition to being useful with the suspend cards, there was also a brief window where you could use both of these to cascade into the powerful Planeswalker Tibalt Cosmic Impostor as early as turn 2. This was possible because the rules about modal double-face cards at the time meant that you could cascade into Tibalt's other side, the 2-mana Valki, God of Lies, and then you could still choose to cast Tibalt Cosmic Impostor. Decks that were doing this were successful in Modern and Legacy, and ultimately they rewrote the rules for how Cascade interacted with modal double-face cards to stop this. But even that wasn't enough to keep Cascade nonsense in check in Modern. Violent Outburst got banned in Modern earlier this year because Cascade decks had gotten too good. However, it's still being played in Legacy. Meanwhile, Ardent Plea is still legal in Modern and still seeing play there, but it's less commonly featured in Legacy. It's going to be interesting to see which of these wins out in the end, but suffice it to say, both of them have been crucial to the creation of an entire subset of decks in multiple formats. But even with a resume like that, there are still 4 cards that are even more impressive in Alara Reborn, like our number 4 card, which is Sphinx of the Steel Wind. Interestingly, despite the fact that Alara is a block specifically about the 3-color shards, and Alara Reborn has 39 such cards, there are only 2 cards with a full 3-color identity on this list, and they're both Esper, the Sphinx here and Thopter Foundry, which we saw earlier. Anyway, Sphinx of the Steel Wind is an artifact creature that costs 5 generic, a white, a blue, and a black, for a 6/6 with flying, first strike, vigilance, lifelink, and protection from red and green. As is the case with most cards in Magic that cost 8 mana, people rarely actually pay that cost, and that's what makes the Sphinx so good. People get it into play early, and its huge body and slew of keywords make it very difficult to beat, potentially downright impossible if someone is counting on red or green removal to get the job done, and people often are, as those are the 2 best colors for artifact removal. That prohibitive mana cost did keep it from seeing play in Blockers Standard, and it even has only a single point in Modern, but it's found tons of success in the Eternal formats, where you have access to the most powerful ways to get around ever paying for the Sphinx. In Legacy, it's been put into play using Show and Tell, Goblin Welder, and Animate Dead. It sees the most play in Vintage though, where it's commonly put into play with Tinker. The Sphinx has been especially active over the last few years, where its protection from green became even more powerful following the printing of Force of Vigor, which quickly became a ubiquitous card in the format. The Sphinx is likely to keep gaining points going forward, and 2 of the 3 cards in front of it are inactive, so it's probably going to soar even higher on the list. At number 3, it's Bloodbraid Elf. For 2 generic, a red, and a green, it's a 3/2 with haste and cascade. It's more like Bituminous Blast, where for the most part it's been played because of the powerful 2-for-1s it generates, and not because it enables combos. Basically, if a cascade card costs more than 3, it starts to become challenging to rely on them in those styles of decks. But luckily, the elf adds a relevant body to the board that can even swing right away, while always cascading into something useful in the decks that play it. It saw a lot of play in Standard and Modern Jund decks. One of the most famous plays in the Modern Jund deck was hitting Liliana of the Veil with this cascade, which was pretty tough to come back from. Adding a 3/2 with haste and getting an insanely strong Planeswalker for only 4 mana was insane. But even just hitting something like Lightning Bolt with the elf feels great. Jund decks were ultimately deemed too good for Modern, and as a result, Bloodbraid Elf got banned in 2013. It did get unbanned in 2018 though, and since then it's gone back to seeing some play in the format, but it hasn't put up any top 8 since 2023. At number 2, it's Kasali Pride Mage. For a green and a white, it's a 2/2 with Exalted, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. The Pride Mage gives you a reasonably efficient creature who can also destroy artifacts and enchantments, and that's pretty nice, especially when you factor in Exalted, which means that on its own the Pride Mage is a 3/3 attacker, and most of the time the Pride Mage won't be alone, and you'll be able to attack with more formidable creatures who can take more advantage of the buff. Modern has been where the Pride Mage has found the most success. That format has always had toolbox decks that have run various cards like Collected Company, Birthing Pod, and Court of Calling that allow you to search up cards that are especially effective in a given board state. So if an opponent has a good target for the Pride Mage, you can search it up. In Legacy, it's been played in a variety of decks, with Maverick being its most frequent home, but the Pride Mage doesn't have any points since 2018. And at number 1, it's Maelstrom Pulse. For 1 generic, a black, and a green, it's a sorcery that destroys target non-land permanent and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent. It's the kind of removal that aggro, midrange, and control decks have been interested in at various times, and it's especially nice that it gives you a main deck way to blow up problem permanents that most removal can't target, like planeswalkers, artifacts, and enchantments. And it's great at destroying tokens or other multiples your opponent might have. It's one of the most versatile and powerful removal spells around, and that's why it has so many points and has been played across pretty much every format. Its most common home across all the formats is Jund, and that's the primary deck that it's been played in Standard, Extended, and Modern. Maelstrom Pulse is going to continue to increase its score in a big way, not only because it's being played in non-rotating formats, but also because it's now legal in Standard as a result of a reprint in Foundations. It'll be in Standard for quite a while, and it's hard to imagine that it won't see significant play in the format, so I think it's safe to say that the Pulse will be the number 1 card from Alara Reborn for the foreseeable future. So those are the top 10 cards from Alara Reborn. Do you like multicolored cards? Then check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific sets, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.